ladies there? Are y'all perfect?
Sorry, Brother Rodney. There is another gentleman, Brother Isaac, that
If if I may, let me start with a brief introduction of myself, since this is my first time. Um, I obviously, as you can see, my name is Rodney Livingstone. I am in Leoma, Tennessee, in the United States. It is 10 minutes after noon here. So we're 7 hours behind you guys. It's midday and Monday, midday here. I have been very thankful for the invitation to be a teacher, to be a leader in this discussion of the New Testament survey, which is the class that I have taught a few times um, throughout my ministry. And but I am a local preacher here, and so. Been in Tennessee for 17 years now. I grew up in the state of Mississippi, which is not too far away. But I have a wife and I have three children. My oldest is a senior in high school, so she's graduating, and then I have two boys who are eighth grade, who's in the eighth grade, and the youngest is in the third grade. Um, I have been through several college courses myself. Um, Not that that qualifies me in any way, but I have taken New Testament survey at a couple different levels, at the university level and the graduate level, even critical introduction to the New Testament at the graduate level as well. With that being said, um, I don't intend for this class to be uh, very deep, and by that I mean I don't I don't intend for us to be real critical of the text. What I hope to accomplish is I hope when this class is over and I'm going to be joined, I'm going to close this window behind me. Sorry about that. A pretty good glare on the camera there. But what I anticipate us doing is just trying to get a brief working knowledge of the 27 books that make up our New Testament Bibles. I I right now am planning to take us through Second Thessalonians, and then another brother in Christ, Jeremy McFarland, will pick up in First Timothy and take you through Revelation. So we're going to kind of tag team this for the next 4 weeks, and so what we want to do is just look at each book. We want to look at. I thought I had all the handouts and everything for this class. There they come in right there, maybe. So thank you, brother. I'm sorry that I didn't get those to you sooner, but I thought I had them all, and then looking back, I did not have them. Um, I I will start by giving you my email, so that you have. I should have put this on those forms. So if you're not in class, and obviously a couple are not, um, and you would like for me to email you these forms, I'll be happy to do that. My email address is RODNEYL, as in the first letter of my last name, Rodney L 2002 2002 at yahoo.com. Again, that's Rodney L 2002 2002 at yahoo.com. And so feel free to email me any questions, any misunderstandings, anything you would like to discuss further. Um, I'll be happy to do that. Or I emailed over uh, earlier today the outlines for the first week of class, and a couple of charts. The couple of charts that I emailed over come out of a book, Holman's Book of Biblical Charts. The first one of those is a chart on the development of the New Testament canon. And so that's kind of where we'll start, and then we'll start with Matthew and kind of work our way through. So obviously, there's a few things I like about this chart. Um, Obviously, the Council of Nicene, 325 AD 325. We start getting to having a need to put together a canon, but what you have is that you have different books that are given consideration. So when you and I sit down and when we say we're going to go to the New Testament, well, we immediately think 27 books, Matthew to Revelation. I just want you to understand that all of these books were not adopted as canonical books immediately. That it actually formed throughout various um, councils as they came together and throughout various what we refer to as apostolic fathers through the second century, like Eusebius, like Athanasius, like others, Clement and Origen and others who would quote Irenaeus, who would quote different books that you and I would call Bible books. But just know that the formation of this took some time, and by time I mean 100 years plus. So it didn't just, here you and I sit in the year of 2025, and we have had an accepted canon for, you know, 1700 years. Okay. So we really haven't questioned anything. We really haven't brought anything else. We accept this as God's word with full authority, inspired by God, as Peter would say. God used men to write his inspired word. And so we have these 27 books that constitutes our New Testament, among which, and another thing that this chart does is it kind of color coordinates. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Again, not trying to demean you in any way or to oversimplify anything, but I do want this to just be a simple class. And when it's over, I just want you to be able to take the New Testament and be able to work with it and work through it and know how to use it as best as possible. So you have the first four books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We call those the Gospels. Obviously, they are the accounts of the life of Jesus. They are all unique in and of themselves. So we're gonna look at all of these individually, Lord willing. So if I say something here, expect that I probably will repeat it. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have a different audience. It seems they have a different agenda, if you will, a different style of writing. Um, and we believe that each one of those would bear the name of its author, thus why it gets the name. But all four of them are going to deal with the life of Jesus. And so, if you're looking for something in the life of Jesus while on earth, then obviously you're going to go to one of those four books. Excuse me. The fifth book you come to is the book of Acts. Well, the book of Acts is a book of history. It's the history of the church. It's the history of the apostles. Of course, some people would call it the Acts of the Apostles. Well, it's not all the apostles, and it's not all of their acts. So so let's be careful with that, as we'll see tomorrow, perhaps tomorrow evening. We get to the book of Acts, we'll talk about it in more detail and which apostles are highlighted within the book. But it does include a lot of history of the early church and the events that surround the apostles, as it were, the 12 apostles of Jesus. When you get to the sixth book, you get to the book of Romans. And Romans starts a large section of 13 books, all the way down to the book of Philemon, that we are fairly confident without getting into critiques of the text, which would be which would be a critical introduction to the New Testament. We're not going to question a lot in this class. We're gonna take the external evidence and the internal evidence of the book itself, and we're just going to kind of go with that when it comes to author and dates and those sorts of things. So the 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 large consensus of conservative scholarship, if I could say it that way, will give Paul, the Apostle Paul, credit for writing Romans through Philemon, 13 books. Now, the one that kind of gets hung out there is the book of Hebrews. And so if Paul did write the book of Hebrews, then he wrote 14 books. But we'll get, or actually Jeremy will get into that toward the end of the class with Hebrews a little bit, and he can handle that as deep as he wants to handle that. But just know that the authorship of Hebrews is somewhat questioned in the world of biblical scholars here. So, but from Romans to Philemon, and so you have 13 different letters with the possibility of a 14th. And then after that, you get into seven. Hebrews kind of stands there as a Hebrews is a wonderful book. I know y'all have a class just on the book of Hebrews. Maybe one day I'll take the opportunity to teach that class. I love the book of Hebrews. Um, and 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 if we did teach that, if I did teach that class, we would deal more with who the potential authors are of that book. But but it's kind of there as, if it's the last of Paul's letters or if it's the unknown authorship, if you will, in the chart that I can share or have shared through email. It's painted orange in the chart, just kind of as an unknown here. And then you get into seven, what we call general epistles, which you have James, Peter, John, and Jude. So you have four different authors, and we believe that those bear the name of their authors. So James was written by James, Peter, first and second. Then you have John, first, second, third John, and letters, much like the ones that Paul wrote, Philippians, Colossians, those type letters. But obviously, we don't believe Paul to be the author of them. So they kind of stand in a different category, if you will. And then, last but certainly not least, you have the book of Revelation, which is a whole different genre, uh, a book of apocrypha. It's in this chart. It's called a book of prophecy. There's a lot of fulfillment of prophecy. And so, obviously, if you get into, if you have, most colleges probably have a class on Revelation itself. It's certainly a book that you could spend weeks in and not even touch the tip of the material there. Very good book nonetheless, but it has its challenges when it comes to the New Testament and understanding. And so there's your 27 books, and there's kind of the breakdown. The other chart I sent, uh, that I can email to you if you'd like that, is out of this same book, Holman's Book of Charts, and it's on Paul's letters, and so we'll talk about it more on Thursday evening, Lord willing. But let's start with Matthew. Let's um let's think about book one here. Uh, Um, Again, the things we want to highlight is things like author, date. If there is a significant background to it, um, we might mention that. Who's the audience? Who's receiving the letter? What seems to be the purposes for the book or the writing, and and then what are some themes? Um, I, I can I can tell you that. that you can find a lot of this material out there on the internet. What I will point you to, I did not give you on any of the handouts, and I will not in this class, is outlines of the book. Um, go online, find you an outline of the book of Matthew that you like. Um, Find you an outline that lays the book out in a way that you could understand it. What I enjoy is having an outline that I can take and look at and go, okay, if if somebody says to me Matthew 5, well, that's the Sermon on the Mount. Okay. Because I know based on my outline that Matthew 5, 6, and 7 are the Sermon on the Mount. So the first four chapters are the early part of Jesus's life. Okay. You get to the fifth chapter, fifth, sixth, seventh chapters, you have the Sermon on the Mount. Only recorded in Matthew, not recorded in Mark, Luke, or John. Now, obviously, some of the teachings are repeated, but in that package, if you will, Matthew's the one to do that. When you get into chapter 8, chapter 13, you get into parables. When you get into the 26th chapter of Matthew, so you have chapters 8 through 25, that's this massive amount of teaching and parables and illustrations that Jesus used. When you get to chapter 26, 26, 27, 28, well, that's the last week of his life on earth. That's the trial, that's the cross, that's the burial, that's the resurrection. So I don't want to tell you, okay, here's the outline that you need for the book of Matthew. To be honest with you, in my folder on the New Testament, I have like five outlines of almost every book, just because some can be more extensive than others. And and I just want you to find an outline that works good for you. I would love for you to be able to kind of know the layout of the book of Matthew, and kind of how it progresses, obviously from the beginning of Jesus's life to the end of Jesus's earthly life. Obviously, Jesus is eternal; He's God, so He didn't start in the book of Matthew. He existed from the very beginning, and He didn't end in the book of Matthew. But that's the material that's in the book of Matthew. And so, who is writing here? Okay, the author. Well, the author is a guy we believe by the name of Matthew. That's why the book is called that. So who is Matthew? Well, according to the text, he was a tax collector. When you go to Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, and I don't know how much time we will allow to look through the actual text itself, but when you go to Matthew 9, as Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he arose and followed him. In Mark chapter 2 and verse 14, Mark calls him Levi. So uses the name Levi there, the son of Alphaeus. So Matthew, or Levi Matthew, here we find out he was serving as a tax collector. He's going to go on in chapter 10 of Matthew and verse 3, and we're going to learn he's named as one of the 12 apostles. Matthew chapter 10 and verse 3, as Jesus is naming his 12 apostles, Matthew, the tax collector, the very one that he called back in chapter 9 there to come and follow him. And what I will just say is, I mentioned guys like Eusebius and Clement, Pappus. These guys all lived, in the early centuries. Clement, like toward the end of the first century, Pappus in the second century, Eusebius in the third century, and all of these guys agree that Matthew, the tax collector, is the one writing here. And so again, if you do a New Testament uh, uh, critic class, you can get into. There are other suggestions as to who the author here is here, but this class, and for our purposes, we just going to go with the majority, if you will. Um, you the book doesn't tell us specifically who wrote it. There will be books as we move through the New Testament that will, but this one doesn't. And so we have to ask the question, okay, why is it the book of Matthew? Well, obviously somebody thought that Matthew was writing here, and so thus he's given credit, if you will. The book's named after him. We come to another introductory thing about the book, and that is the date. What we find in the book is that so in AD 70, there was the destruction of Jerusalem. And what you'll find in your New Testament uh, dating patterns is that, so like for you and I, let's make a parallel here. I don't know about you, but now in my life, I date everything in reference to COVID. So when somebody says, when did that happen? I will say, well, it happened just before COVID, or it happened just after the COVID pandemic. Something that was worldwide, something that all of us was impacted by in some way or another. Um, if I were to bring up the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Centers of September the 11th, 2001, well, that's a key date in my life because I'm an American and I'm an American citizen. That's a part of our history. You may know about the event in South Africa that happened that affected the whole country there, but it didn't affect me, and so it wouldn't use, just like September the 11th, 2001 would not be a good dating reference for me and you to use. But the destruction of Jerusalem, an event that had a world impact where everybody. So when you start dating things, you start looking for references to. I don't find any mention of that in Matthew. So the the conclusion is that the book was written prior to that. Now, putting a date on it exactly is kind of hard. Obviously, Jesus would have been born, roughly uh, just 4 BC. Let's just go with 4 BC. Okay, we know that Herod was reigning. We look at, Matthew and Luke, and both of them give us a lot of details about the government around the birth of Jesus at the time. And so if we start Jesus living at 4 BC, Luke tells us he started his public ministry at age 30. Okay. So we're 26 years, AD 26. um, you know, Obviously we're going to get into John, and John mentioned some Passovers. The Passover was once a year, so we start going, okay, did Jesus participate in an earthly ministry for 3 years? Maybe there's four, so 3 to 4 years, and so maybe you've heard, that Jesus was 33 or he was 34, when he was crucified. Okay, again, we can't with absolute certainty, but we're AD 33, AD 34. Okay, you have Acts chapter 2, the establishment of the church. Okay, so obviously we're into the 30s, right? Now, you've got to realize that in the time frame of the book of Acts, and we use the book of Acts to put a lot of things in its time frame, because it is truly a history of the New Testament world there. So you got guys like Matthew here, who's an apostle, who's doing all these things with the infancy of the church. And so we're hard pressed to believe that he would have sit down and wrote this book in those years. Okay. So thus now you come out to, okay, Paul starts his missionary journeys. That's going to be a big part of the book of Acts in the late 50s, mid 50s, late 50s into the 60s. So then it's believed, based on many different things, like the Roman emperor, and who, some little snippets of that. But obviously, and so with that being said, I'm going to put Matthew in the 60s, AD 60s, somewhere in that decade of time, before AD 70, because Jerusalem is referred to as the holy city, Matthew 4 and verse 5, Matthew 27 and verse 53. So Jerusalem, the holy city, is referred to twice in the book. So it's obviously there. It doesn't seem to be in a disarray of any kind. So prior to AD 70, but the other thing you got to realize is that Matthew is writing about early first century. So the life of Christ, I mean, he may be 30 years removed from the actual timing of a lot of this, and maybe even as much as 50 or 60 years removed from some of the timing. So you get into the background of all of this, and obviously, you know that the Roman Empire was in existence and in authority and rule. You go back to Daniel chapter 2, and you have the dream of Nebuchadnezzar there, and Daniel interprets that dream about the different reigns and rules of people. And so, you come down through the end of the Old Testament, you get to Malachi, and you have that period of silence, which we believe to be roughly around 400 years. And then you have the birth of Jesus. And so everything that is going to transpire. So we're in that last kingdom. We're in the reign of the Roman rule. We're preparing ourselves for Jesus to set up a kingdom that Daniel talks about that will last forever, that will be established and there will be no end, as he's interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream there. Your kingdom's going to come to an end, but there's coming a time when there'll be a kingdom, Daniel 2:44, that will last forever. And so we're in the beginning stages of that kingdom. And obviously, we're in Matthew's book, in Matthew's record, we're being told about the king of that kingdom, the church, that's obviously still in existence today. So the background is, pretty synonymous for uh, for all of the gospel accounts, because you're recording the life of Jesus, which obviously happened at the same time. And so you have different points of view, but you have the same period and the same background of time there. What does vary, um, from gospel account to gospel account, is the audience. And so we read the book of Matthew, and we conclude that Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience. And we do so for several reasons. We do so because he uses the phrase son of David. He refers to Jesus as the son of David. Well, obviously, to the Jews, David is King David, Old Testament David. He's the figure, right? I mean, you go all the way back to Abraham, but you have Abraham, David, and now Jesus. And for the Jews, that would be, I mean, that would be the key heroes, if you will, of their faith. And so by Matthew using the son of David, by Matthew making several references to Abraham, even in his genealogy, as you look at Matthew chapter 1 and the genealogy there, he uses Abraham and David to structure that genealogy coming down to Jesus there. He uses the kingdom of heaven instead of the kingdom of God. And again, um, to a Jewish audience, remember that the Jews thought the name of God to be so holy that they wouldn't even write it out completely. And so you had Yahweh, and they would shorten Yahweh down to just those four consonants because they didn't want to spell it completely out because they were afraid they would mess it up. And so God's name was so holy. God was so holy. God was so respected and revered by the Jewish people that they would very, I mean, they were very cautious about using the word God, the name God. And so they would refer to it as the kingdom of heaven. And so Matthew would use that phraseology. That would be different than Mark, who would say the kingdom of God. And we'll talk about Mark in just a moment. But obviously, I think I put on your handout that heaven is used some 55 times in the book. Matthew quotes over 100 Old Testament passages. Okay, those Old Testament passages aren't going to mean anything to the Gentiles. They don't have an Old Testament. It's not going to mean anything to the Roman people, or uh, obviously the Jewish people had the material, had the Old Testament scriptures as best they could have them in their papyrus and all there, and so they had the scrolls, and they would know the scrolls. So thus it makes sense that Matthew would use them. When you come to purposes of the book of Matthew, well, obviously the huge purpose is just to show that Jesus lived, to show that he was a real person in flesh. He came to this earth. Obviously, why he came to this earth, to fulfill, for the Jews, to fulfill Old Testament prophecy. Sadly, they missed him. They were looking for a prestigious royal Messiah. They were not looking for a commoner, as it were. And so, sadly, they missed Jesus. But that's what Matthew is writing for, is to try to show that he came, that he lived, that he died, just as uh, God had foretold and promised. Um, Obviously, his ministry, the teachings, the events, the impact, the life that he lived, um, the events that would ultimately lead up to the cross are all very significant to the purpose of Matthew. And then finally, some themes to think about. Well, the nature of Jesus is a huge theme in the book. When you think about Jesus as the Messiah, uh, the as you begin in chapter 1 and verse 1 of Matthew, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So there you go. And it structures all of that for this Jewish audience, but not just as the Messiah, as God in the flesh, but also as a teacher. As Jesus would go about teaching and preaching and and explaining, guiding people. So the nature of Jesus is a huge theme of the book, but also salvation is a huge theme of the book. Jesus talks about and teaches what salvation is going to look like, what it's going to mean, the purpose that it has behind it. You see, God is building this history, and he has been building it for hundreds of years, all the way back from the beginning in the Garden of Eden, and then to the promises of Abraham, and just so forth and so on, and the fulfillment of that. And so God is building this history, and this history is going to culminate in the salvation history, that is, in the cross. And so when Jesus dies, when he's buried, when he is raised the third day by the Father, that provides, that brings about the salvation that has been promised, that has been guided, that has been leading up to this point. And so obviously salvation history is a big theme of the book. And then finally, discipleship. um, Jesus goes out to the seashore in Matthew 4, and he sees Peter and Andrew and James and John, and he calls those fishermen. They're out there fishing, James and John's with their father, and and he calls them, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And so that whole idea begins in Matthew 4, about verses 18 through 22. Uh, that whole idea of discipleship. Come follow me, and I will teach you, I will guide you, I will lead you, I will help you. To know and to learn uh, my ways and my will. And so, discipleship, learning from a teacher, being a follower of a teacher, obviously is a huge theme here. Later in the book, Matthew 16, he's going to ask them, "Who do you say that I am?" And some of the disciples are going to turn and not go with him anymore, and he's going to say to Peter and the others, "Are you going to leave as well?" And so obviously discipleship carries with it a great level of commitment that's centered around love, that's centered around righteousness, that's centered around holiness. And so Jesus is teaching discipleship. He's trying to help them to understand what discipleship looks like, and how it's going to require the commitment that is necessary. And then the last thing I give you there on the handout are passages that are only found in Matthew. And you see them listed there. I don't want to take the time to go through them all, but there they are. If you're intrigued by any of them, perhaps the most intriguing one on the list for me is Matthew 18. Um, in Matthew 18, Jesus is being questioned, and even Peter questions him there uh, about forgiveness, and he gives an extensive amount of teaching on forgiveness with illustrations and the importance of forgiveness. And I just find it interesting. A topic like forgiveness, a very important topic to Christianity, and we get a huge teaching out of Matthew 18, 15 through 35, really. And of course 15 through 20 kind of sets all that up, and then 21 through 35 is kind of the sermon there, if you will, by Jesus. And what's fascinating, and why that's fascinating, is because if you take Matthew out of your Bible, then you don't have that passage. And so that's why I think it's unique to just kind of look at what is peculiar to, or what is unique to Matthew. That if you didn't have Matthew, what would you, not that you would miss anything, but what might not be fully fleshed out or discussed in great detail. And one of those things for me is Matthew 18. The other one I'll mention there, Matthew 23, 13 through 36. In that passage is the woes to the Pharisees and scribes. Remember, he gives seven woes there. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Woe to you. He's rebuking them. He's trying to encourage them. He's trying to exhort them. But if if Matthew doesn't record that, then we might not have that. And so again, the outlines that you could find for Matthew. I would encourage you, if you keep a folder of your classes, I would encourage you to go find an outline of Matthew that works good for you. Print a copy of it, and stick it in your folder there with your Matthew handout. I'm going to go ahead and move to the book of Mark. I know that our break is approaching here at the top of the hour, and I'll be aware of the time here, and so we'll kind of start Mark, and then we'll have to kind of finish Mark. Today, by schedule, we want to try to cover Matthew, Mark, and John. And so if we could get started on Mark here, you might notice, if you do have the handout, and again. Uh, uh, Email me. I'll get those to you for the entire week, and then I'll send you next week's when I get those done, Lord willing. Uh, but you might notice on the handout that I try to number the books. And one of the things you might notice at the top with Mark is that I've got the number one or two. Mark is a shorter book. Okay. I realize that when you open your Bible, it's Matthew, Mark. And so if we're just numbering 1 to 27, then Matthew's number one, Mark's number two. But a lot of times, what would happen in writings of antiquity is that when you would have a longer version, the conclusion would be that whoever wrote the longer version actually started with the shorter version, started with the more condensed version. And so, using that um, mentality, I'm not saying it's right necessarily, but using that mentality, Mark is shorter. So, there are those who suggest that Matthew and Luke actually had Mark's account, and we're not going to get to Luke till tomorrow evening. And there's a reason for that as well, to attach it to Acts. But it's suggested that Matthew and Luke could have had the material from Mark and expounded on that material. Kind of been working with the shorter version, if you will, to lengthen and to give more detail about certain things. Obviously, we start here in our introduction to the book of Mark, some 16 chapters, Matthew being 28 chapters, Mark being 16 chapters. So it's obviously shorter. The chapters are shorter. It is a lot faster paced. So Matthew just moves you through the life of Christ, and you're just kind of bouncing along, and Matthew just kind of takes you from this scene to the next scene to the next scene. And it might be two or three scenes in one day, or there might be a 3 or 4 day gap, or, and he might tell you about, the chronology of it might get shuffled up a little bit. Mark is just bam, bam, bam. Just let me tell you this. Okay, boom. Um, if I were to think about, you know, how this class is going to feel. Well, this class is going to feel like a Mark book, okay? Because it's just going to be bam, bam, bam. Like we can't spend an hour on each book because we don't have 27 hours. So, just hitting the top, hitting the highlights, hitting the introductory material, just to give you a knowledge of each book. So that's kind of what Mark's doing. Like, I don't want to tell you about all the details. I don't want to tell you about everybody that was there. I don't want to go into all of the backdrop and who said what and what said, I just want to tell you the main focus of it. Now, obviously getting ahead of myself a little bit, but obviously that's going to then lend us to think that he's writing to a different audience. He's writing to an audience that is probably not Jew. So a Roman audience or a Gentile audience. Obviously, the Gentiles would be anybody who wasn't Jew to a Jew. But maybe he's writing to the Romans, a non-Jewish audience who don't have all of the Old Testament background. Okay, so it does them no good to go into the history of Abraham. They don't know who Abraham is. It does them no good to go into the history of David and how this guy's kin to David through his great, 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 great grandfather and all of these generations, because they don't know who David is. I'm not going to say they don't care. Maybe they've heard the name David. Maybe they know King David, but he's not a hero to them like he is to the Jews. So thus Matthew would point the Jews to David. Mark's just saying, hey, there was a guy named David, lived in the Old Testament. He was a great king for the Lord. And oh, by the way, Jesus is one of his ancestors. And just kind of Mark doesn't have anything to do with the birth or infancy of Jesus. He just goes right into his teaching. But even in his teaching, even in his recording of Jesus's teaching, he doesn't go into a lot of detail because these people don't have the background that the Jews would have had. And so it does appear to be a different audience. Again, the date, uh, we don't have any record of Jerusalem being destroyed. So again, we're going pre AD 70. If it was, written before Matthew, then we're going early 60s. If it was written, as book number two, so to speak, Matthew was already written, then we're going maybe late 60s, but somewhere in that decade of AD 60 to 69, in that period. Who is the author? Well, again, just taking the bulk of conservative scholarship, uh, it is believed that the author is the one to whom the book bears the name of, Mark. In Acts chapter 13, we have a guy by the name of John Mark, um, that travels with Paul and Barnabas. He goes on that first missionary journey. We actually meet him in Acts chapter 12, about verse 12, Acts 12:12. And then he's going to leave Paul and Barnabas in Acts 13:13, which is in Perga, um, and he's going to go home. John Mark is. And so it is concluded that John was his Jewish name, Mark was his Roman name. So why would the book bear the name Mark? Well, because we believe it was written to a Roman audience. So what would they call him? Well, they would call him Mark, not John, even though we know him as perhaps the double name, John Mark. I just did a wedding ceremony on Saturday evening here, and the young man who was getting married, the groom, his name was John Riley. And he grew up at the congregation here where I preach, and I've always called him Riley. Well, that's what we knew him as, Riley. Well, he meets his bride, he meets his wife now in college. Well, guess what you go by in college? Well, you go by your first name in college. So guess what he was called in college? John. He was called John. When his professors would refer to him, he was John. He was John. So guess what she knew? She knew John. Well, in the wedding ceremony, I had to call him John. I never called him John in my life. So I didn't even know who I was really talking to. That's kind of the scenario here. You have John Mark, the same way I had John Riley. Some know him as John, some know him as Mark. And so it would obviously make some more connections here on your handout. He, according to Colossians 4 and verse 10, was a cousin to Barnabas, a fellow worker. In Acts chapter 15, you have a division between Paul and Barnabas. They get ready to go back on that second journey, and Barnabas wants to take John Mark, and Paul doesn't. And so, you have this division. But then in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 11, Paul says, "Bring John Mark to me." That's the last time we see him. And Paul says that he is useful, or he is helpful, or he is an encouragement to me. And so, again, when it comes to authorship, you have Eusebius, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, all second, third century. Nobody really questioned the fact that John Mark, was the author here. Um, I'll mention this before we take our break. If you get into some text criticism, Mark 16, verses 9 through 20, and I did not put this on your handout, but there is a huge text problem there in that many of the older manuscripts do not have Mark 16, verses 9 through 20. And so what some have concluded is that Mark actually came in later and wrote those verses, and that's all he wrote. Someone else wrote the first 16 chapters, and Mark kind of added a footnote later to verses 19 through 20 of chapter 16. Well, I don't personally hold to that view. I have explored the concerns of the manuscripts and the critics there of Mark 16. And again, if you have a class just on Mark, you can dive off into that deeper. But it does affect the authorship thoughts a little bit. And so that's why I just mention it here. Again, I don't think I put it on the handout. But those who would say, again, the book doesn't tell us who wrote it. So just like Matthew, we can't go to chapter 1 and verse 1 and say, okay, John Mark, the writer here. It doesn't have that in there. So some would leave the author anonymous and then give Mark credit for that last little uh, appendage that kind of gets tacked on in their minds in those last few verses in later manuscripts as they were. And so uh, again, just to mention that text problem as it relates to the authorship. And if you choose to go deeper in your study of that, you are more than welcome. It is 8 o'clock your time, 1 o'clock my time. I don't know if we should open the floor for questions. We certainly can do that at the end of class. I propose that we take a 10-minute break at this point. Come back at 8:10 your time. We'll finish up Mark. I want to try to get into John, and then I'll try to leave some time at the end of class for any thoughts or comments or questions.
Thank you, brother.
I hope some of the things that we're sharing together is helpful. I hope this is not just a waste of your time here. And let's finish the book of Mark, and then we're going to jump over to John. And then, like I said, I'll try to finish up around 10 till, so that'll give an opportunity for any thoughts or questions, or if you have any suggestions as to how to make class better or how I need to be using our time efficiently. Then if you don't want to say those out loud, I will welcome your emails. Again, excuse me, I will mention my email again. It's Rodney L, RODNEYL 2002 at yahoo.com. And if you do not have any of the handouts or any of the pictures, the images of the charts that I was talking about earlier, I'll be happy to attach those to an email over to you at any point. So we were talking about Mark, the second book in our New Testament canon. Uh, Already looked at the author, the date, the audience. Even looked at, mentioned the text problem there right before the break. Um, uh, think about with me here for just a moment the purpose and the themes of this book. So obviously Mark is writing to a different audience, so he has a different purpose, whereas Matthew was trying to show Jesus as Messiah, as the nature of Jesus as the coming one to fulfill the prophecies given to the Jews. Mark doesn't have to do that because he's writing to a group of people who don't have the prophecies from the Old Testament. So obviously he wants to show Jesus as king, but he does it very differently in that he shows him as a servant. So Mark focuses in on Jesus's behaviors of serving, like humility and selflessness. He he wants to obviously reinforce the idea of discipleship, which is one of the purposes and themes of Matthew, but his focus is not on discipleship. His focus is on the power that one gains by serving. And so Mark would highlight the passages like the first will be last and the last will be first. And Mark will highlight the passages where Jesus would say things like, if you want to be great, you must be a servant. That's the kind of things that Mark would highlight in his recording, because his purpose is different, because his audience is different. Now, obviously, themes would have to include the kingdom of God, as we mentioned, not the kingdom of heaven like Matthew, but the kingdom of God here. And then also the nature of Jesus would have to be a theme. So when you think about purposes and themes, just know that those two kind of bleed together a little bit, kind of overlap, and you're kind of talking about the same thing there in your introductory of the book. Now, the last thing I'll mention about Mark before we move on to John is the things that are unique or peculiar to Mark. And I've already mentioned this, but I'll mention it again that he gives no infancy of Jesus. So, like Matthew spends 3 chapters talking about his family, talking about the angel Gabriel coming to Mary. Matthew records Mary's reaction to giving birth to or going to give birth to the Son of God. Uh, Elizabeth, John the Baptist, all of that. Mark, nothing. Mark has none of that. As a matter of fact, Mark, just for record's sake, Mark 1:1. In the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it's written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I send my messenger before you to prepare the way, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight his path. John appeared, verse 4, baptizing in the wilderness. Boom, here we go. We're halfway through the 3rd chapter of Matthew, and we're literally 4 verses into Mark. So you see the contrast in style, you see the contrast in the emphasis behind the narrative. So John the Baptist is baptizing in the Jordan River, verse 4 of Mark 1. That doesn't happen till Matthew 3, about verse 15, 16, 17 in Matthew's account. And Luke's the same way. So it's over in chapter 3 into chapter 4 as well. So there's no birth, there's no record of his. He literally in Mark 1, Jesus is an adult male ready to minister to people. Um, Matthew tells us about him getting left behind in Jerusalem at age 12. And okay, Mark does none of that. There are some passages listed there. Um, most of them have to deal with certain interactions that Jesus had, like Mark 7, verses 32 through 37. Jesus meets a man that is deaf and mute, and he heals him. Well, anybody could have recorded that, but only Mark records that. Um, when you get down to chapter 16, you have different points of view from the resurrection, from the scene of the resurrection. That's kind of cool. Remember this. I probably should have said this in the beginning, but I didn't. So I'm going to say it now. So you've got Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we mentioned in the beginning you've got the 4 gospels that all record the life of Jesus. So so let's illustrate it this way, okay? I'm looking at 2 ladies in the classroom. All right. If I were to ask the 2 of you to take your pen, pencil, whatever, and to write a description of me right now in 2 lines, and then read that to the class, you both would be describing, you're both looking at the same image of me right now, but you would both write something different. And by different, I don't mean that one of you's right and no, both of you would be right. But one of you would focus on the fact that I have a black shirt on, and the other might not ever say anything about the fact that I have a black shirt on. Well, it doesn't change the fact that I have a black shirt. That is a true factual statement. Now, one of you might notice what's behind me on the wall, and you might describe that. The other might not say anything about it. Okay, view the gospels that way. Okay, they're describing the same life of Jesus, but one of them might say he's got on a black shirt, while the other says nothing about what kind of shirt he's got on. It doesn't change the fact that Jesus has on a black shirt. It it's still a fact. It's just that Mark don't care what color shirt he's got on. And so that's kind of the way you need to view, these peculiar different. Okay, so just because Mark records Jesus healing a deaf and mute man and Matthew doesn't, does that mean that it wasn't real? Well, of course not. It's just like the two of you ladies describing the image of me that you see. Just because you leave out a detail about that image doesn't change the fact that the image is real. It's just you're focused on this particular detail while the other one of you is focused on a different detail. Same way with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're focused on different details about different stories, thus the peculiarity of what they record. Now, when you get into something that they all record, which is very few things, but like the resurrection, for example, they all record the resurrection. So you go to the end of each book and you read what they write, you have a different narrative, a different perspective, a different viewpoint about the resurrection. And when you take all four of those and put them together, it's actually really cool. But that obviously takes some time and some effort. But these other passages are just, okay, Mark tells you, but Luke doesn't tell you. Well, that's okay, because there's some things Luke tells you that Mark doesn't tell you, or Matthew tells you that Luke doesn't tell you. It doesn't make one right and one wrong. It's just what they're focused on. It's the detail they want to point out. Now, with that being said, one interesting detail in Mark 14. So again, don't have time to read a lot of the scripture, sadly, but I do want to read Mark 14, verses 51 and 52. Mark 14:51. And a young man followed with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, and he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Well, you read those two verses, and I kind of chuckle because I think, what in this world is going on here? Well, Jesus has been arrested. And this young man sees that Jesus is being arrested and he follows. Well, they proceed to try to catch this young man and as it were, arrest him with Jesus. And so in his effort to get away, he obviously, it's in the middle of the night here. He's probably got on his pajamas, which is nothing more than probably his undergarments. And so he wraps a linen cloth around him just so he's halfway modest as he goes out. And they grab that robe, if you will. They grab that cloak, if you will, and he runs away. Well, he's probably not completely naked. He's probably got his undergarments on, but in terms of modesty, he is naked. Now, why would I even bring that up? Well, I bring that up because Mark is the only one that records that. Well, that doesn't make it any less true than any of the rest of it. But why is Mark recording it? Well, I will tell you that the consensus is that the unnamed boy in that passage is John Mark. So why would he tell you that? Well, because he lived it. That's that if that is in fact him, he's the only one that tells you that because that's a real story to his life. John doesn't care nothing about this young man getting his bottom garments ripped off and running away half naked. John doesn't care because it doesn't affect John. Matthew doesn't care because it doesn't affect Matthew. But Mark cares. Why? Because if it is him, he lived it. So he is the young boy. Well, I can't say that for certainty. But what I can say is he's the only one that records it. And so that is unique in that. And then we have to wrestle with the question of why in the world would anybody record that? Because it has no significance to the story of Jesus unless it is Mark. And then it has all the significance in the world because he's an eyewitness. He's right there. He's living it. And he almost gets arrested with Jesus and taken with him and who knows how that would have worked out. But obviously, he would have been a young man, because even in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 12, when we meet him and when we get to know John Mark, the person, we believe he's still a young adult there. So here, you know, 20 years earlier, he's obviously a boy of sorts, a young boy of sorts, and he's just intrigued by what's going on. Maybe he's been awakened by the mob that is arresting Jesus there. Again, some speculation, but something unique to think about, and certainly it has some validity to it. When it comes to the outline of Mark, again, my instructions are the same. Find you an outline. You can find one that is 4 or 5 pages long, or you can find one that is 3 or 4 lines long. Find you an outline that helps you work through the book and kind of know the different periods of the life of Jesus in the book. Obviously, going from beginning to end there. So, with the next 25 to 30 roughly minutes here, let's move to John. Now, if you notice in your handout, I put book 4. Obviously, book 4, because Luke's going to be book 3. But tomorrow evening, Lord willing, we're going to handle Luke and Acts together. We'll only have 2 books tomorrow night. And then on Thursday evening, we'll only have one, hopefully, in the book of Romans. So we are going to get to slow down just a little, maybe, but there'll be a whole lot of more details that I want you to have when it comes to those books. So when we move to the book of John, okay, so you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And I realize we hadn't talked about Luke yet, but typically those are called the synoptic gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those 3. And the reason why the term synoptic is basically it's the same view through a different lens. And so that's what that means. You're looking at the same picture, but through a different lens. And so, like I said a while ago, y'all, you 2 ladies in the room are looking at the same image, but you're looking through different lenses, meaning you're looking through your eyes, you're looking through your experience. Maybe one of you knows somebody who looks like me, and so you're thinking, man, he favors this guy. But the other one of you don't know who that guy is. So you don't make that connection. But you're looking through your lens. But you're looking at the same image. You're just looking through a different lens. Well, John, though John is a record of Jesus's life, it is not considered one of the synoptic gospels, because it's just a totally different style of writing. Okay, same time frame, same material, if you will, but a whole different style. And so you'll have people say, well, I read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and those just sound like the same books almost. But then I got to John, and man, it was just weird. Like, it was totally different. Well, that's exactly right. You could read Matthew and read Luke and think you were almost reading the same book, but you cannot read John, and you're in a different book at that point. Now, before we get into some of the peculiars of it, the author, well, again, we're just going with the census across the board of conservative scholars. John, whose name is on the book, the disciple whom Jesus loved. In John 21, he refers to him as that. An eyewitness. When you get to John 1 and verse 14, in the prologue there, he says in verse 14, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Okay. He's talking first person there. He's including himself, the writer is, into the eyewitness. We beheld, we saw, us, he became flesh among us. You and I couldn't write in that first person pronoun terminology. You and I can't say Jesus became flesh and dwelt among us. We would have to say he dwelt among them. But John, the author here, could. We believe this John, whom the disciple whom Jesus loved, to be that inner circle disciple. Peter, James, and John, one of the three there, a son of Zebedee, a brother of James, the one that was out fishing, who left their father to come follow Jesus. And then at the end of this book in John 19, Jesus is hanging on the cross, and he looks down at his mother and he says to Mary, "Behold your son." And he says to the son, "Behold your mother." Well, in John 19, verses 25 through 27, that's the author. That's John. That's the apostle John. That's the disciple whom Jesus loved. When it comes to date, man, there's just nothing. I can't even I can't even begin to try to help you on the date. I've seen things as early as AD 40. That seems way too early. To AD 140, and that seems way too late. What we know is that, and I'm going to pass this class off to a different teacher. So Jeremy will handle first, second, third John and Revelation. But consensus is that this same John wrote first, second, third John and Revelation. So five of the 27 books written by this same author. And we know when we get to the Revelation that he's on the Isle of Patmos around the end of the century, depending on which date you use there. The later date of Revelation can put you around 100, 105. The 90s are pretty common dates there. The early date would back you up into the 70s. But but anyway, that would be a critical thing to discuss there in New Testament critical introduction. But whatever the case, you're going to be hard pressed to get John all the way to AD 140. And his other writings seem to fall in the 90s, as best I can tell based on my uh, readings and understanding. So I'm going to put it in the 90s, AD 90s. Now, if that be the case, then here's what that does. That puts it some 30 years after Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay. So if Matthew, Mark, and Luke have been written and they've been in circulation for 30 years, then John doesn't need to tell anything about Matthew, Mark, or Luke. You already know all that. You've read that book. He needs to do he needs to do another book, if you will, uh, for further understanding. But he don't need to repeat any of that because you already have all of that and you've already read all of that. So when it comes to his audience, I think we're safe in concluding that he has a primarily Jewish audience based on some of the imagery and some of the illustrations that he uses. Obviously, the audience has to have a knowledge of like the Passover feast. Okay, that's going to be the Jews. So they need that knowledge. Um, so, there are others that uh, there are other elements to suggesting that Jews would have been the recipients here. When it comes to the purpose, well, I think he gives us his purpose. And again, you may wish that I was reading more of the text, but I would like to read these couple of verses. John 20, verses 30 31. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book, John says. But these are written, John 20:31, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So that's the purpose. Just let the book tell us its purpose. Again, this book doesn't come out and say, "Hey, I'm John and I'm writing the book." So you're, and it doesn't come out and say, "I'm John and I'm writing the book to," We're going to get into some books later that's going to do that. Those are going to be easy. And the author is going to tell us who he is, and he's going to tell us who he's writing to. But John doesn't do that, and Matthew didn't do that. Mark didn't do that. But in terms of purpose, I do think John comes straight out and says, "Here's my purpose. Here's here's what I'm doing. Here's why I'm writing, and here's why I have written the things that I have written, so that you may believe in Jesus." So obviously, his purpose is to produce true belief in Jesus as the Son of God, as deity, as God. Uh, Coming from the Father there. The word believe is found almost 100 times in this book. And so obviously belief is a big uh, emphasis of John's there. When you come to themes, well, I've kind of put the themes down there on your handout as the structure or as the main points of the book. One of the themes is certainly the I am statements. If John is going to produce belief in Jesus as the Son of God, then what's he got to do? Well, he's got to establish Jesus as the I am. Remember when Moses was standing at the burning bush in Exodus 3, and he asked, God said, Moses, I need you to go to Egypt and get my people, get the Israelites out of Egypt. And Moses says, well, God, when I tell them who sent me, what do I tell them? And God said, you tell them I am has sent you. Well, when you come to the book of John and Jesus refers to himself as the I am, then that makes him God. That makes him equal to God. That produces faith in the material about Jesus being God in the flesh. Yes, as John 1 begins there. So, excuse me, you get into the I am statements. Um, in John 6, he says, I am the bread of life. John 6:35. In John 8 and verse 12, he says, I am the light of the world. In John 8 and verse 58, he says, before Abraham was, I am. Now there's you a big one to the pre-existence of Jesus. John 8, they're focused in on Abraham and their father Abraham. And Jesus says, what do you mean your father Abraham? Before Abraham ever came to existence, I already existed. Before Abraham was, I am. When you drop down to John 10, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And he has a lot of illustrations there about being the good shepherd. In John 11, remember Lazarus died, and Mary and Martha, his sisters, were mourning his loss. And so in John 11, Jesus says to Martha, I am the resurrection. In John 14, a very familiar passage in verse 6, I am the way, the truth, and the life, Jesus says. And then finally, in John 15 and verse 1, he says, I am the true vine. And so there's 7 I am statements there, proving his existence and teaching us things about his existence. If we were to do a class on the book of John, we obviously would spend a class probably on each one of those 7 and talk about them in great detail. There's also the miracles of Jesus. John puts forward 7 miracles of Jesus in his book. That seems to be a theme. I'd be happy to email you those. I won't take the time in class, but it starts in John 2 with the water to wine. That's his first public miracle, as we refer to it, and then goes all the way to the last one being raising Lazarus from the dead in John 11. That would be the 7th miracle. He did more miracles, but John records 7 of them. In John 6 is the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. Why would I mention that one? Because that's the only one mentioned in all 4: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so that's kind of a unique story there. What John tells us in John 6 is that there was a lad who had a couple of loaves of bread and 5 fish. Matthew didn't tell us about the lad. Mark didn't tell us about the lad. Luke didn't tell us about the lad. John does. The other three tell us we had two loaves and five, we had five fish and two loaves, but they didn't tell us where we got them. John tells us where we got them. The apostles try to buy this boy's meal, and Jesus takes that meal and feeds 5,000 men, not counting women and children. And they pick up 12 baskets of leftovers, which is probably more food than what they started with. So you feed 5,000 plus people and you have more food when you get done than you did when you started. But certainly you and I could see how two loaves of bread and five small fish are not going to feed 5,000 people on a normal day. But this isn't a normal day. This is a day with Jesus. And just it's always intrigued me that all four of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are impacted by that miracle, and that all four record it there. One of the key things to John's writings is a contrast. He really likes setting things in contrast. And I just list three here on the handout: life and death. Obviously, you see there's a huge contrast there. Life and so you have life presented as holy and righteous and good, and you have death, sin and things, corruption, uh, um, black, if you will, dark, unholy, uh, uh, grimacing. Uh, all of that revolves around the concept of death. And so you have that contrast. You have light and darkness. Other contrast, obviously, light being righteousness and holiness, darkness being sin and evil, and the importance of being light and being in the light versus darkness and avoiding darkness. And then you have the truth versus a lie, and obviously you see the contrast there between what is true and what is a lie. I will just mention, I did not put this on your handout, but I will mention that there is a text problem in the book of John. Maybe you're aware of John 7:53 through John 8:11. This is the woman that is caught in adultery. And that's not found in some of the early manuscripts. And so that presents, and if you were in a New Testament critical introduction to the New Testament, you would need to dive off into that and look at the different sources and the different manuscripts and ask yourself why, and wrestle with, you know, ultimately it doesn't add anything or change anything. That's what we need to know in an introductory class. We just need to know that if you take John 7:53 through 8:11 out of my Bible, I still have my Bible. If you don't believe that in the oldest manuscripts, and therefore it's not authority from God and it's not inspired, that somebody came along later and added it, if that's what you want to conclude, then just take it out. And because it doesn't teach anything that I'm not taught in other places. So I can go somewhere where there's not a question, where the confidence of the text is a nearly 100%, and I can get the teaching from there. Um, I'm not suggesting you need to take this passage out of your Bible. Some scholars will put it at different places in the Bible, and they call it a floating text. Like they'll put it at the end of the book of John and say this is where it really should have been. Again, the point is it's there. You need to know about it. If all I'm trying to do is introduce you to something that might be problematic from the book of John. I'm not ready to dive off in and give you all the nuances and the answers to trying to deal with the problem. But you need to know about it, or at least be exposed to it in this introductory class. Peculiars to the book of John. Well, there's a lot of peculiars. There's a lot of unique things because it's just totally different. It just really is. Um, Only about 8% of what's in the book of John is found in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. So it's, it doesn't have any birth stories. It doesn't have any demon stories about somebody being demon possessed. It doesn't have any parables. The book of John, you know, when Jesus would go out and say, the kingdom of heaven is like unto, and he would tell a parable. He would tell about a man who went out to sow seed, and when he scattered those seeds, some fell on the wayside, and some fell on good ground, and some fell in the rocks. And, those are all parables. Well, John doesn't have any of those. He doesn't have any of those stories that have an earthly meaning with a heavenly implication. That's what a parable is, and so it's not there. Don't go to John to try to find the Lord's Supper. You can find Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper in Matthew or Luke, but don't go to John because John doesn't have that in there. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It doesn't mean that it's not. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that it's not a significant part of a New Testament Christian's life, partaking of unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine on the Lord's Day. No, no, those are important things, but John just doesn't record that. What John does record in John 13 through 17 is this long discourse about his final instructions to his disciples. John's in the room, right? John is being impacted greatly. So John would record that Jesus takes a towel, puts it around his waist. He takes a basin of water and he stoops down to the ground and he washes their dirty, dusty feet. John would record that. John would record Peter's discussion with Jesus in that moment. And then John would record Jesus getting up from the floor with that basin of water and then beginning to tell them, I'm going back to the Father. In a closed room, behind closed doors, with just his intimate, close people. And I'm going to send a comforter. I'm going to send the Spirit. I'm going to send the encourager. But I must go back in order for the encourager to come. See, that's all John 16. Nobody else has got that. But John's got it. And he's got it in great detail because John is focused heavily upon the emotional side of things, the spirit side of things, not so much the daily. I'm not suggesting that John doesn't have some daily uh, interactions of Jesus along the way. He certainly does, but that doesn't seem to be his focus. John's focus seems to be on the teaching, on the importance of what Jesus is, the message of what Jesus is trying to say, the true background, the true spirit behind it. Again, when it comes to outline, I would encourage you. I could give you a four line outline of the book of John, and just break it down. Very very simple. Obviously, the end of John goes to the same place that the other three go, and that is to the cross, and that is to the resurrection. And so, all four of them are going to be parallel in that. Uh, Telling, writing, description of Jesus, his trial, his crucifixion, and ultimately his resurrection. Of course, John's going to have the 21st chapter tacked on to his account, which is after the resurrection that happens in verse 20. And so he's going to give, or chapter 20 rather. So he's going to give a lot more detail about those handful of days that Jesus was in the resurrected form before ultimately ascending back to the Father in heaven. Again, focusing on the ministry, yes, but focusing on a different aspect of the ministry. We might make note that John is the one who helps us to try to date the life of Jesus. How does he do that? Well, in John 2 and verse 23, John mentions the Passover. Okay. In John 6 and verse 4, John mentions
the Passover. In John 13 and verse 1, John mentions the Passover. So John 2:23, 6:4, chapter 6 and verse 4, chapter 13 and verse 1. He definitely mentions three Passovers. Now, you might put in parentheses chapter 5 and verse 1. There might be another Passover there. Again, that would be a topic for a critical introduction to think about that. But I just want to mention this in case you ever hear somebody say, well, Jesus was 33 when he died. Okay, well, the Bible never says he was 33. So how do we know that? Well, Luke says he was 30 when he began his ministry. I mentioned that earlier. Now, what we know from Exodus chapter 12 is that the Passover was an annual feast, once a year, specific month, specific day. So, if we're observing a Passover in 223, we're observing a Passover in 6:4, we're observing a Passover in 13:1, then that means that Jesus, who was a Jew, who lived according to the Jewish customs and the law, because he had not died yet. Remember, the law does not go fulfilled until he dies on the cross. So, what does he do when it comes time for Passover? He observes the Passover. If there is that fourth one in chapter 5 and verse 1, then that puts him 4 years down the road, not three. But regardless of whichever way you want to go there, what you cannot do is say that Jesus was 70 when he died on the cross. That's not going to work. We can't justify that age in any stretch of the imagination. But if you've ever wondered where we get the age of 33, why 33? Well, that's the best guess we've got, thanks to John and his recording of Jesus observing at least three Passovers and maybe four in during his ministry, thus putting him to the age of 33. So, with that being said, we have covered Matthew, Mark, and John very quickly. Um, what what comments, questions? I want to leave the last few minutes here to give you an opportunity to speak.
Um, it's kind of moving backwards a bit, but may you please repeat the verses on the I am statements, please?
Okay, I'd be happy to do that. So, so the I am statements from the book of John. You start with chapter 6, verse 35. That is the bread of life. He actually says that three times in that chapter. He says it again in verse 48, and he says it again in verse 51, all of chapter 6. Then you move to chapter 8 and verse 12. That is the light of the world. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, chapter 8 and verse 12. And then you drop down to verse 58, John 8 and verse 58. That is the discussion about Abraham. And he says, before Abraham was, I am. He just says, I am, echoing the thoughts of Exodus 3 and verse 14. If you want to put that cross reference there back to the burning bush in the wilderness of Midian there with Moses. And then the fourth one is chapter 10, verse 11 and verse 14. He says it twice there. I am the good shepherd. That's the passage where he's talking about the sheep, and the sheep know his voice, and the sheep follow him because he is the good shepherd. Number 5 would be chapter 11 and verse 25. That is the death of Lazarus. where he says, I am the resurrection. He will say, I am the resurrection and the life. So if you want to put those two together, but he tells Martha, when he says, you know, your brother will be raised. And she says, yeah, I know he'll be raised in the resurrection, meaning the end of time when all the dead are raised. And Jesus says, I am the resurrection. Uh, and then number 6 is chapter 14 and verse 6, where he's telling them, you know, don't let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not, he's telling them about heaven. I'm going to go to prepare a place. And then he's asked about where he's going. Thomas asked, Lord, you know, he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. John 14 and verse 6. And so, you know, essentially there's 3 there, if you will, but all tied up in I am the way, the truth, and the life, all tied up in one there. And then the 7th one is John 15 and verse 1, where he's given that illustration about the vine and the branches, telling, you know, hey, if you abide in me and I abide in you, you will bear fruit, you will be fruitful. But if you're not fruitful, you will be dead, you will be cut off, and you will be thrown into the fire. And so he says in verse 1, I am the true vine, and you are the branches.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Any other questions or need for repeating anything?
Yes, I do have another question. Kind of silly, but I need clarity. So at the beginning of this, you mentioned something to do with more like a council of some sort that had to determine which books can be regarded as canon and
Okay.
none. What's the difference between the two? What classifies a book as a canon or canon? What disqualifies it as a canon?
That's a very good question, and honestly, it is a very extensive answer. And so, what I would say to you briefly is that they had checkpoints, if you will, of books that were termed to be valid, and therefore books that were not. Um, and so, what they would do is they would put them through this regiment, which is very extensive and would take a while to go through all of that. But they would sit down as a group in this council, and they would discuss these different things. And what I will tell you is that perhaps the 2 biggest in was James and Jude. They got the most criticism, and I really think, in my humble estimation of what I've read and studied, Jude gets the most criticism because it quotes sources outside of the Bible. Like, it doesn't quote Isaiah. See, nobody's going to question Isaiah, but Jude quotes some other sources. And it's like, what in the world, is going on here? And then James, so a lot of people want to put James in contrast to Paul. And I don't think we should. I think faith and works are together. But a lot of scholars see James trying to tear down the writings of Paul. And therefore, they wanted to exclude James because he talks about faith without works being dead. Whereas Paul writes a lot about faith and the importance of faith. And so I think James got a bad rap because you had a lot of people who held very highly to Paul's writings, and rightfully so. But there are books out there, and maybe you're familiar with, there's a book of Moses out there that is not in the canon. There is There are many books in that 400-year period of silence between Malachi and Matthew. The Maccabees, for example. Maybe you hear some of those names thrown around. There are some other documents or manuscripts out there that are believed to have been written during this time. But what the councils were trying to do is determine which books were authorized to be in the canon of the scriptures, because here's what would happen a lot. You would have a lot of people who would write under what's called a pseudepigrapha. And so my name's Rodney, and I know that if I write you something, you would probably just throw it in the garbage. But if I sign it as Paul, the apostle, whoa, now you're going to have a hard time wadding it up, throwing it in the garbage. So a lot of times what would happen is you would have people who would write under other names trying to get recognition. And so they had to sort through all of that. And they would have ways, and they would have checkpoints, and they would have data points, and they would obviously be looking for things like contradictions and things that didn't match up, maybe errors that would be there. And so there would be things like that. But what you would need to do is you would need a text criticism course and somebody really educated in the critiques of the text to kind of walk you through that. But yeah, it was a process, and it was not done half-heartedly. It was very carefully considered, and so what I would tell you is that the 27 books we got in our New Testament canon are the books that God wanted us to get, because I do believe that God was overseeing that whole process, just like He was overseeing the inspiration and the transmission of the text down to us. Hope that helps some.
It does. Thank you.
Well, it is 2 minutes after 9 your time. So I would like to close this in prayer. I will look forward to being back with you tomorrow. We will cover Luke and Acts. I want to spend the first hour in Luke and the second hour in Acts. And hopefully we can get into the text a little more and do a little more reading from the scripture itself. But today was just a lot of getting going and trying to cover a few books along the way. So let's pray together, and you can be off to bedtime. Father in heaven, we're so grateful for your love and your care for us. So thankful for this opportunity, for this avenue, for the blessing of technology, for being able to be in South Africa through Zoom, and to be able to interact with these great people who desire to know more about you, more about your word, more about your will for our lives. Help us to be encouraged through the study of your word, to know better how to handle it, so that we truly can be good students of yours and good workmen that are rightly handling and dividing the truth. Dismiss us in your love and care this evening. With all those who are in class that are in South Africa, give them a safety through the night of rest. Be with the rest of the day here in the States, and we just pray that you will guide us through it all. We ask this prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you, Brother Rodney.
You're
Thank you
you're
so
very
much.
welcome.